My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Chicago, working as a project coordinator for a small but busy marketing agency. From the outside, my life looks simple. Wake up, go to work, meet a few friends for coffee, maybe read a book on weekends. But behind that ordinary routine is a story I never thought I'd have to tell. A story about love betrayal, and a truth that would turn my entire world upside down. For most of my life, my mother Claire was my entire universe. When my biological father left before I was even old enough to remember his face, she stepped into every role. She was the one who worked endless shifts as a nurse, coming home with tired eyes and the faint smell of hospital antiseptic clinging to her clothes. She was the one who made sure I never went to bed hungry, even when it meant she skipped meals herself. And she was the one who, no matter how exhausted she was, always tucked me in at night and whispered softly, "You're my whole world, Emily. It's you and me forever." We didn't have much, just a small rental house with peeling paint and creaky floors, but we had routines that made it feel rich with love. Saturday mornings were for pancakes, always a little burnt on the edges, because she'd get distracted telling me stories while she cooked. Sunday afternoons were for trips to the library, where we'd wander through the aisles like it was our own little kingdom. Birthdays weren't filled with big presents, but she always managed to find something that felt special. One year, it was a secondhand bike she'd saved up for months to buy. Another year, it was a thrifted copy of my favorite book, its pages soft and worn, but filled with meaning. She taught me kindness, even when the world wasn't kind to us. When kids at school teased me for not having a dad, she told me, "You don't need two parents to know you're loved. I love you enough for a lifetime." And I believed her. I grew up thinking that nothing could ever break the bond between us. I studied hard in school, not just for me, but for her. I wanted to give back some of what she had given me. When I earned a scholarship to a good university, she cried harder than I'd ever seen her cry, hugging me so tightly I could barely breathe. At the bus station the day I left for college, she kissed my forehead and whispered, "No matter where you go, you'll always have a home with me." Even after I graduated and moved to Chicago, I stayed connected. I sent her money whenever I could, even though she always insisted she didn't need it. I came back for holidays, and we'd sit in the kitchen for hours just like we used to. She eventually remarried while I was in college to a man named Mark. He was quiet, polite, the kind of man who fixed leaky faucets, and smiled in family photos without saying much. I wasn't particularly close to him, but he seemed to make her happy. And that was all I wanted, for her to be happy after so many years of sacrifice. Looking back now, I realize how much I wanted to believe everything was okay. I wanted to believe that after all she'd been through, she'd finally found stability. But life has a way of revealing cracks you didn't see before. Because one day the woman who had once told me I was her whole world looked me in the eyes with a coldness I didn't recognize and said words I'll never forget. "You are no longer my daughter." I can still hear the sound of her voice, flat, almost emotionless, like she was talking to a stranger. I can still see her hand on the door, shutting it firmly in my face. That same door I had walked through countless times as a child, now closed to me forever. I stood on that porch, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't understand how the woman who once sacrificed everything for me could suddenly push me away like I didn't matter. I had grown up believing she was my only family, that it was us against the world, and in one moment, with one sentence, she shattered that belief completely. But here's the thing. What I didn't know then was that my story wasn't over. Because just when I thought I had lost everything, someone I thought was gone forever came back into my life. Someone I never expected to see again. My real father. And his return would change everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the truth behind the lies I had been living with for years. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to pause for a moment and think about this. What would you do if the person you trusted most suddenly turned their back on you? Have you ever been told you no longer belong to the only family you had? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because this isn't just a story about betrayal, it's a story about what happens when the truth finally comes out. And trust me, what came after that day was more shocking than I could have ever imagined. I started noticing little things, small shifts that didn't seem significant at first, but began to add up like puzzle pieces I couldn't quite fit together. When I visited my mother after a few weeks away, the house didn't feel the same. It used to smell faintly of vanilla candles and laundry detergent, a comforting scent that always reminded me of safety. But now it felt stale, the air heavy in a way I couldn't explain. The once well-kept garden had weeds creeping along the edges of the pathway, and the curtains which she used to change with the seasons hung limply as if they hadn't been washed in months. She greeted me with a smile, but it wasn't the warm, familiar smile I knew. It was tight, almost forced, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me that everything was fine. There was a nervous edge to her voice when she asked about my drive, her eyes darting to her phone every few minutes. I couldn't help but notice that she now kept her phone locked, clutching it close whenever it buzzed. It wasn't like her; she used to leave it lying on the kitchen counter without a second thought. During dinner, the silence between us felt thicker than usual. I tried to talk about work, about my friends in the city, but she only nodded distractedly, her mind clearly somewhere else. When I asked how she and Mark were doing, she quickly changed the subject, offering me more mashed potatoes, even though I hadn't finished the first serving. It was subtle, but I could tell she didn't want to talk about him. Later that night, when I went to grab a magazine from the coffee table, I noticed an envelope tucked beneath it. It had the cold, formal logo of a bank stamped on the corner. I didn't open it. I knew it wasn't my place, but just seeing it sent a quiet ripple of unease through me. Mom never left unopened mail lying around. She was always meticulous about bills and paperwork. I brushed it off at first. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe it was nothing. But the next day I noticed more. The kitchen faucet was dripping steadily, a metallic plink that echoed in the silence. Normally, Mark would have fixed something like that immediately. The dishwasher had a panel missing, exposing a tangle of wires, and the once gleaming countertops were cluttered with receipts, old newspapers, and what looked like half-finished letters. When I offered to help tidy up, she shook her head too quickly. "Don't worry about it," she said, her tone sharper than I expected. "Everything's fine, Emily. You have your own life. You don't need to worry about mine." But her eyes wouldn't meet mine when she said it. As the weekend went on, the tension only grew. I caught her whispering on the phone late at night when she thought I was asleep. The sound of her voice was hushed, urgent. I couldn't hear the exact words, but I caught fragments like, "Just a little more time, and I'll figure it out." When she noticed me standing in the hallway, she ended the call abruptly and forced a laugh. "Just a friend," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Go back to bed." Even Mark seemed different. He was more distant than usual, spending most of his time in the garage with the door closed. When I greeted him, he gave me a distracted nod and barely spoke. I couldn't remember the last time I saw them actually talk to each other during my visit. There was a tension in the air between them, like an invisible line they were both avoiding crossing. By the time I drove back to Chicago, the unease had settled deep in my stomach. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that they were just going through a rough patch like any couple might. But something about the way she hugged me goodbye too quickly, without her usual lingering warmth, left me feeling unsettled. A few weeks later, I came home again for a quick visit. That's when the signs became harder to ignore. The paint on the front porch was peeling badly, and the steps creaked under my feet more than they used to. Inside the living room, lights flickered weakly, and the warmth that used to fill the space felt drained. I noticed small things missing: a family photo that used to sit on the mantel, a decorative vase she loved. When I asked, she said she'd just moved things around, but the vague tone of her voice didn't convince me. While she was in the kitchen, I went to the spare room where I used to sleep when I visited. There were stacks of unopened mail on the dresser, all from banks, and what looked like official notices. I felt a pang of worry, but didn't dare open them. Instead, I tucked them back exactly where I found them. At dinner, I casually asked about Mark's work. She hesitated just a little too long before saying, "He's handling some things right now. It's complicated. Then she immediately tried to steer the conversation toward my job again, her voice overly bright, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. That night, lying awake in the guest room, I heard them arguing in the living room. Their voices were muffled, but I could make out enough to know it was serious. Words like "loan deadline" and "we can't keep this up" floated through the thin walls. My heart pounded as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, realizing there was something very wrong that no one was telling me. The next morning, she acted as if nothing had happened. She made me pancakes like she always used to, smiling and chatting about trivial things, as if the arguments and the hidden mail didn't exist. I wanted to confront her to ask directly what was going on, but every time I opened my mouth, the fear of pushing her away stopped me. On my way out the door that day, I glanced back at her. She stood by the kitchen sink, staring out the window with a look I couldn't quite place. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was something heavier, like a secret she was carrying that she couldn't share. She caught me looking and forced another smile. "Drive safe, Emily," she said, her voice soft but distant. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought was solid in her life was slowly crumbling. I didn't know what it was yet, but I could sense it. Something was coming. Something big. And even though I didn't know the truth then, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I came home from work and found an unfamiliar envelope in my mailbox. I almost tossed it aside, assuming it was a mistake. But then I saw my mother's name printed on the return address line. Though it wasn't her handwriting, this was from an institution. I turned it over slowly, my heart sinking as I read the bold lettering, "Notice of Delinquency." My stomach clenched. It was from the bank in her town, addressed to her, but forwarded to me by mistake. The amount listed made my head spin. $200,000 overdue, a payment already late for 90 days. I stood there frozen in the entryway of my apartment, rereading the letter as if the numbers would change. My mother had always been careful with money. She budgeted everything down to the last cent when I was growing up. We never lived lavishly, but she never missed a bill. To see her name on something like this didn't make sense. I called her immediately, my hands trembling as I held the phone. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm, too calm, as if she was bracing herself. "Mom," I said, my words coming out rushed. "What is this? I just got a notice from the bank about some loan you're behind on payments. $200,000. What's going on?" There was silence on the other end. I could hear her breathing slow and steady. Then she spoke, her tone cool and clipped, in a way I had never heard before. "Emily, that's none of your concern. It's being handled. You don't need to involve yourself." "What do you mean, it's none of my concern? You're in trouble. Why didn't you tell me I could have helped?" My voice cracked, panic rising in my chest. "You don't understand," she said flatly. "This is not something you can fix. Just focus on your life. I told you I'll take care of it." But there was no reassurance in her voice, no trace of the mother who always confided in me before. She sounded distant, almost like a stranger. I couldn't let it go. That night I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as scenarios played out in my head. Had Mark lost his job? Were they in some kind of emergency? I couldn't believe my mother would take out a loan that large unless something was desperately wrong. The next morning I made a decision. I couldn't just sit in Chicago and wait for her vague promises that everything would be fine. I packed an overnight bag, got in my car, and drove the 3 hours back to her town without even calling ahead. When I arrived, the house looked worse than the last time I'd seen it. The lawn was overgrown, and the shutters on the windows were hanging crookedly. The once bright blue paint on the front door was chipped and dull. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place that had been slowly abandoned. I knocked. For a long time there was no answer. Finally, she opened the door, and the sight of her made my heart ache. She looked smaller somehow. Her shoulders were hunched, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She was wearing an old cardigan I remembered from years ago, but it was frayed and faded now. Her hair, usually neat and brushed, was pulled back in a loose bun, with stray wisps falling out. "Emily?" she said, surprise flickering across her face. "What are you doing here? I came to see you," I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mom, we need to talk." She hesitated before stepping aside to let me in. Inside the house was dimly lit. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee. Papers and unopened envelopes were scattered across the coffee table. There were dishes piled up in the sink, and the once cozy living room felt cold and cluttered. I sat down on the edge of the couch, searching her face for answers. "Mom, I know about the loan," I said finally. "I got a letter. Why didn't you tell me you don't have to go through this alone?" She looked away, her jaw tightening. "It's complicated," she murmured. "I don't care if it's complicated. I can help. Please, just tell me what's going on." Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment I thought she might break down and tell me everything. But then she shook her head slowly, almost imperceptibly. "No," she said quietly but firmly. "This is my problem, Emily. I don't want you involved." I felt frustration rising. "You can't shut me out like this. You raised me to be responsible. You taught me to face problems, not hide from them. And now you're hiding from me." Her eyes finally met mine, and for a fleeting second, I saw a glimmer of pain there. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered. "And I don't want you to see me like this, like what I asked, my voice trembling. You're my mother. Nothing you could say would make me stop loving you. But I can't help if you won't let me in." She looked down at her hands, wringing them together. "It'll be fine," she said after a long pause. "We just need a little more time. Things will turn around." But even as she said it, I could tell she didn't believe her own words. I glanced around the room again, noticing more things I hadn't seen before. A pawn shop receipt sitting on the table. A family photo missing from the wall, leaving a pale rectangle where it used to hang. An old vase I remembered her loving, now gone. I realized they were selling things quietly, desperately to try to stay afloat. "Where's Mark?" I asked carefully. She stiffened. "Out," she said shortly. "He's working on something." The way she said it made me uneasy. Working on what? Her eyes darted away. "It doesn't matter." I wanted to push more, but I could see her shutting down, retreating behind a wall of silence. That evening I stayed with her making tea and trying to bring some sense of normalcy back. I cleaned the kitchen while she sat at the table staring blankly at her phone. She barely touched her dinner. I caught her at one point rubbing her temples like she had the weight of the world pressing down on her. Before I left the next morning, I tried one last time. "Mom, please let me help you. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone." She stood by the door, her face pale but resolute. "Emily," she said softly, "I appreciate that you care. But I need you to trust me. Just stay out of this for now." It broke my heart to walk away without answers. Driving back to Chicago, I felt torn between anger and helplessness. Anger that she was hiding something so big from me, and helplessness because I could see she was drowning and wouldn't let me throw her a lifeline. I told myself maybe she was just overwhelmed, that she'd call me in a few days and finally open up. I clung to the hope that this was just a temporary crisis, something that could still be fixed. But deep down, there was a gnawing feeling I couldn't shake. Something about her tone, the way she avoided my eyes, the quiet despair in her movements. It all told me that whatever was happening wasn't just temporary. It was bigger than I imagined. And I was about to find out just how deep the truth really went. ChatGPT deny. I drove back to her house a week later, determined this time not to leave without real answers. The tension that had been building inside me reached its breaking point. I couldn't just sit in Chicago pretending everything was fine when I knew she was drowning. This time, I had a plan. I would simply tell her I was paying off the loan. I had the savings, and if it meant she could breathe again, I was willing to sacrifice it. Surely she would see it for what it was, a gesture of love, not pity. When I arrived, the house was even darker than before the blinds drawn, despite the afternoon sunlight. I knocked and waited. She opened the door with a wary look, as if she'd been expecting someone else. For a fleeting second, I saw relief in her eyes that it was me, but it vanished almost instantly. "Emily, what are you doing here again?" she asked, her voice edged with tension. "I came because I can't stand watching you go through this alone," I said firmly, stepping inside before she could stop me. "I know about the loan. I know you're behind, and I've made a decision." She stood silently as I placed my bag down and turned to face her. I'm going to pay it, I said simply. All of it. You won't lose the house. You won't have to worry anymore. For a long moment, she just stared at me. I expected tears. I expected relief. I expected maybe even gratitude. But what I saw instead was something I didn't recognize, a flash of anger, raw and sharp, building into something darker. Her lips curled into a bitter smile. So now you think you can swoop in like some kind of savior? She spat. You think you're better than me because you live in the city with your fancy job and your neat little life? I blinked, taken aback. Mom, no, this isn't about me being better. It's about helping you. You're my mother. I don't want you to suffer. Her voice rose, trembling with fury. Helping me? Don't you see what you're doing? You're humiliating me. You want me to go to Mark and say, oh, don't worry, my daughter had to clean up my mess because I'm too weak to handle it myself. Is that what you want? I tried to keep my voice calm, even as my chest tightened. This isn't about humiliation. This is about saving your home, about making sure you're safe. Why are you making it sound like I'm trying to hurt you? She took a step closer, her face flushed with rage. I didn't understand. Because you are. You don't get it, Emily. You're just a child. You've always been a child. You know nothing about sacrifice, about what it takes to hold a family together. You come in here thinking you know everything, thinking you can fix everything with your money, and you're just… She stopped, breathing hard. Her hands were trembling. Mark, who had been standing quietly in the corner of the living room, finally spoke up. Linda, calm down. But she turned on him too, shouting, Don't tell me to calm down. This is my daughter acting like she's the parent, like she has the right to judge me. Mom, I said, my voice cracking, I'm not judging you. I just want to help you. Please. Something in her snapped then. She stepped right up to me, eyes blazing, and before I could move or speak, her hand flew across my face. The sound of the slap echoed in the silence of the room. For a second, I couldn't even process what had happened. My cheek burned with a sharp, stinging heat, but the pain was nothing compared to the shock. I stumbled back a little, staring at her in disbelief. Mom. What? You don't get to come here and fix me like I'm some broken charity case, she screamed. You think you're so much better than me now? You're not my daughter anymore. Do you hear me? You're nothing to me. Nothing. My breath caught in my throat. I could barely speak. What? What are you saying? She jabbed her finger toward the door. Get out! Get out of my house! And don't ever come back! From this moment on, you're not my daughter. Do you understand? I don't want to see your face again. I just stood there frozen, the words hitting me like blows. I looked to Mark, desperate for him to say something to stop this madness, but he only looked away, his face pale and unreadable. He didn't defend me. He didn't defend her either. He just stood there silent. I tried one last time. Mom, please. I'm not your enemy. I just wanted to help. Her eyes were cold now, the warmth I had known my entire life completely gone. Help? You're not helping. You're making it worse. You're making me look weak. I told you to leave this alone, but you couldn't, could you? You had to come here and make me feel like I'm failing as a mother. Well, congratulations, Emily. You win. Now get out. She shoved me toward the door. I stumbled back, tears welling in my eyes. My voice was barely above a whisper. I don't understand. I just wanted to save you. You can't save me, she said, her voice like ice, and I don't want you to try. And then with a final furious motion, she slammed the door in my face. I stood on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. My cheek still stung from the slap, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache spreading through my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared at the closed door, the home that had once been my refuge, now completely shutting me out. It was like my entire world cracked in that moment. The woman who had raised me, who had been my only constant after my father left, had just told me I was no longer her daughter. I don't know how long I stood there waiting for her to open the door again to say she didn't mean it. But she never came. I heard the faint click of the lock from the inside, and that was it. Final. Eventually, I turned and walked down the driveway, my legs heavy like they were weighed down with stones. I glanced back one last time, hoping for a sign, anything. But the curtains stayed drawn. Driving away, I felt like I was leaving behind not just my childhood home, but the entire relationship I thought I had with my mother. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly alone. A month passed in silence. My mother didn't call, didn't text, didn't send a single word to me. I tried once or twice, leaving short messages on her voicemail, but they went unanswered. I finally stopped trying, telling myself I needed to give her space. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease crawling in my chest. Something inside me whispered that things were about to collapse, and I wasn't wrong. It started with a phone call not from her, but from an old neighbor who had known me since I was a child. "Emily," she said hesitantly, "I thought you should know. There were people from the bank at your mother's house today. They posted a foreclosure notice on the door. It looks bad. They're saying the house is going to auction." My heart dropped into my stomach. Foreclosure. Auction. I grabbed my keys without thinking and drove the 3 hours to her town, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. As I pulled onto her street, the sight of her house took my breath away. There was a bright orange foreclosure notice nailed right onto the front door. The blinds were still drawn, the lawn even more overgrown than the last time I'd seen it. It looked abandoned, like a shell of the home I grew up in. I ran up the steps and knocked hard, calling her name. No answer. I knocked again and again, panic building. Finally, I went around the side and peered through a window. The living room was stripped bare, no furniture, no photographs, no sign that anyone still lived there. I asked a neighbor where she'd gone, and they only shook their head. "She left 2 days ago," they said quietly. "Took a few bags and just left. Mark hasn't been seen either." My mind spun. Where could she have gone? Why hadn't she called me? The next day, the truth started unraveling in ways I never could have imagined. It began when I went to the local bank to ask for information about the foreclosure. At first, the manager hesitated, but after confirming my relationship to her, he lowered his voice and told me everything. My mother had taken out not one but 3 loans over the last year, totaling nearly $200,000. She'd used the house as collateral. And what were those loans for? An investment in a business plan Mark had convinced her would change everything. But it wasn't just a bad investment. It was a scam. A completely fraudulent project. Mark had promised her it was a golden opportunity, told her it would double their money in 6 months. She believed him. She signed everything he put in front of her. And when the payments came due, the money was gone. I left the bank in a daze. I needed answers. I went straight to the tiny workshop Mark claimed to have been building his new business in, but when I arrived, the place was empty. Nothing but dust and a for lease sign on the door. Later that evening, I got the final blow. A woman named Claire, someone who had worked with Mark years ago, called me after hearing my name around town. Her voice was heavy with sympathy. "Emily," she said, "I think you should know. Mark was seeing someone else, a younger woman. He's been with her for over a year now. He told her he was leaving your mom, that he just needed to sort out some finances first. And when everything collapsed, he disappeared with her. Nobody's seen him since." I felt like the ground was falling away beneath me. So that was the truth. My mother had ruined herself to save a man who had never been worthy of her trust. She'd mortgaged her entire life, handed over everything she had, her house, her savings, her dignity, just to keep him happy. And all along he was betraying her. And the worst part? She knew. I found that out when I finally managed to track her down. It took days of calling distant relatives, asking neighbors, and piecing together fragments of information. I finally found her staying in a dingy motel on the edge of town. When I walked into the room, she was sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the wall. She looked hollow. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. When she saw me, she flinched like she wasn't sure she wanted me there. "Mom," I said softly, sitting down beside her. Why didn't you tell me?" Why didn't you ask for help before it got this bad?" She didn't look at me. Her voice was barely a whisper, because I already knew it was too late. I swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in my throat. "Did you know about Mark? Did you know he was lying to you?" She finally turned to me then, and the pain in her eyes was unbearable. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking. "I knew. I knew he wasn't faithful. I knew the investment was risky. But I wanted to believe he loved me. I wanted to believe I wasn't going to be alone again." Her words hung heavy in the air. She had sacrificed everything to protect him. She had mortgaged the house I grew up in, lied to me, pushed me away, even slapped me and disowned me, all to defend a man who didn't deserve an ounce of her loyalty. And in the end, he took everything from her anyway. She lost the house, she lost the money, and now she'd lost him too. I sat there in stunned silence, a mix of anger and sorrow twisting in my chest. Anger at Mark for his cruelty, anger at my mother for choosing pride and denial over honesty. But beneath it all, I felt something else, something I hated admitting. I felt pity, because as much as I wanted to scream at her for what she'd done, I could see that she was already broken. She had gambled everything she had left on the hope of love and ended up with nothing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want you to think I was weak." I closed my eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. She hadn't pushed me away because she hated me. She'd pushed me away because she hated herself, because she couldn't bear for me to see how far she'd fallen. And that realization hurt more than anything else. In that moment, everything came into sharp focus. She wasn't just a mother who betrayed her daughter. She was also a woman who had betrayed herself, clinging to the illusion of love until it consumed her completely. As I sat there beside her in that dim motel room, I realized there was no going back to what we once had. The home was gone, the trust was shattered, and the man she had chosen over honesty was never coming back. But despite it all, she was still my mother. I couldn't undo the damage. The house was already gone sold at auction to cover a fraction of the debt. Mark had disappeared completely, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions and a trail of betrayal. And my mother, well, she was a hollow version of the woman I once knew. But I couldn't abandon her even after everything she'd said and done. So I did the only thing I could. I brought her back with me to Seattle. The first few weeks were heavy with silence. She barely left the small guest room in my apartment. I'd hear her sometimes in the middle of the night quietly crying, though she tried to hide it. During the day, she sat by the window staring at the city skyline, as if it were a foreign world. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile, in a way that almost frightened me. One evening after dinner, I finally sat across from her at the kitchen table. "Mom," I said gently, "we need to talk." She looked up at me, her eyes rimmed red. "I know," she whispered. "I owe you an apology." She hesitated for a long time, then the words spilled out raw and trembling. "I was so ashamed, Emily. I pushed you away because I couldn't stand for you to see what I'd become. I wasn't just weak, I was desperate. I kept thinking if I just believed in him a little longer, it would all work out. I didn't want you to know how far I'd fallen, so I lashed out. I hurt you, and that's something I can't take back." I listened, my heart heavy. The memory of her slapping me, of her saying I wasn't her daughter anymore, was still fresh, still painful. Part of me wanted to hold on to that anger. Part of me wanted to protect myself from her all over again. But there was something in her voice, something stripped of pride and pretenses, that told me she finally understood what she'd lost. "I can't forget what happened," I said quietly. "But I understand now. You weren't rejecting me because you didn't love me. You were rejecting me because you didn't love yourself anymore." She lowered her gaze, tears streaming down her face. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I just want a chance to be your mother again if you'll let me." I reached across the table and took her hand, but my voice was firm when I spoke. "I'll help you rebuild your life. I'll be here for you. But things have to change. No more secrets, no more lies, And I won't let anyone drag you back into that kind of chaos ever again. If you want my help, you have to let me set some boundaries." She nodded slowly, squeezing my hand weakly. "I understand. I don't want to go back to who I was. I want to be better." And so we began, not a perfect reconciliation, but a fragile, tentative start. I found her a small therapist-run support group for women who'd lost everything to toxic relationships. I helped her apply for part-time work at a nearby library. Little by little, she began to re-enter the world, still wounded, still scarred, but moving forward, one hesitant step at a time. There were moments I questioned myself. Moments I wondered if I was doing the right thing by letting her back into my life. But every time I saw her really try to face the damage she'd caused, it reminded me that healing doesn't come in clean, dramatic gestures. It comes in small, painful steps. I couldn't erase the betrayal. I couldn't bring back the home we'd lost or undo the years she spent sacrificing herself for someone unworthy. But I could give her a chance to start over. And I could give myself something even more important. A promise that I would never allow someone's pride or fear to trap me in their downfall again. This wasn't a story with a fairy tale ending. There was no sudden redemption, no perfect closure. But it was a story of survival, of boundaries, of learning that loving someone doesn't mean saving them at the cost of yourself. For the first time in months, when I looked at her across the dinner table, I didn't just see the broken woman who had pushed me away. I saw the mother who was finally painfully trying to come back to me. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. I've come to realize that sometimes the people we love most will push us away, not because they truly want to lose us, but because they're drowning in shame, fear, or pride they can't let go of. My mother's rejection wasn't born out of hatred. It was born out of the terror of being seen at her weakest, of admitting she'd made choices that cost her everything. But I also learned that love isn't blind rescue. It isn't sacrificing yourself endlessly to fix someone who refuses to be honest with you. Real love means knowing when to hold someone's hand and when to step back and let them face the consequences of their own actions. I still carry the sting of her words that day. "You're not my daughter anymore." That's something I'll probably never forget. But I also carry the memory of the trembling woman in that motel room, admitting she was wrong, finally allowing herself to be vulnerable. And in that, there was a fragile piece of hope. Love and boundaries can coexist. You can care deeply without letting someone drag you into their chaos. You can offer a second chance without erasing the past. It's not easy, and it's not clean, but it's the only way healing truly begins. So now I want to ask you, have you ever been pushed away by someone you loved, only to later discover they were hiding their own pain? Did you let them back into your life, or did you have to walk away for good? Share your story in the comments below, because you never know who might need to hear they're not alone in this. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we all need to talk about the most.